This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support. Hello and welcome to episode 144 of Linux Dev Time. I'm Joe.
I'm Amalith.
I'm Kevin.
And I'm Andy.
Good to talk to you all again. Is Electron really that bad? I hear so many people talking it down. It can't be that bad, can it?
What do you mean by bad? Or what do they mean by bad? So, you are shipping the whole of Chrome, and then if you install a few different Electron apps, that's the whole of Chrome multiple times, and they're taking up memory and so on. So that's an aspect that some people object to.
Right, but having an application available for Linux and cross-platform is surely better than not having it, even if it's slightly more bloated than it ought to have been.
I would agree. Maybe at the time, Electron was the best option for that kind of thing. But nowadays, I say there are better options. Yes, Electron is that bad, and you should use something better.
The thing I've always heard with Electron is that it's the bloated aspect. So storage, if I want to update it, I have to possibly re-download a whole several hundred megabytes of something to get a new version of my to-do app, or just something very basic. But I don't think storage is the number one concern. There's also RAM. There's just better ways to do the type of thing that you want to do, usually, unless that thing that you want to do is cross-platform, in which case, to get all of the metrics better, yes, it is much harder. So I'm conflicted on this one. Is it that bad? Yeah, I don't really like using Electron apps, but if it's the only way to get a cross-platform app, okay, it is what it is. I also wonder who it is exactly that really cares about this, because I think us Linux geeks like the very minimal systems and to have as little bloat as possible, and so we're aware of that. But I also if I were to ask my mom what she thought about this application, unless it just took minutes to load on her computer, she wouldn't really care or even really know.
I'm basically convinced at this point that web technologies are the best way to do a UI. So the fundamental idea of using web technologies to make a desktop app, I'm basically sold on. And I agree with Amalith that there are better ways of using web technologies to make a desktop app at this point, but I would rather have those apps than not, because sometimes some of those apps, for things for work, otherwise I'd have to use Windows or something.
But you know that old meme of I survived another meeting that should have been an email? Maybe Electron apps should have just been a browser tab.
Absolutely. Every time there's any kind of option for me to have a browser tab instead of an Electron app, as a user, I use it. There are some reasons for a desktop app. So one example would be an end-to-end encrypted messaging app where you might not like having your crypto keys in the browser storage. You might prefer to have them stored somewhere else. And also you might prefer to have control over exactly what code you're downloading. If you go to a website, and then you'll get whatever JavaScript is currently hosted on that website. So there's less protection around what code you're running. On the other hand, I use my end-to-end encrypted apps from a browser tab. I'm happy with the security of that because I really prefer that over an Electron app.
I wish I could use browser tabs more often, but unfortunately, I'm one of those weird tab hoarders. So if I were to have an Electron app that was basically just a web browser tab, it would just get lost in the other 2,000 tabs I have.
Oh, but you pin them. I have 15 pinned tabs on the left-hand side of my Firefox. That's all the persistent apps.
I have grouped tabs. I have different workspaces. I have all the solutions, and I still just have, I think it's just ways for me to store more tabs. So it doesn't ultimately help with the problem that I have internally.
You need to declare tab bankruptcy, Kevin.
One of these days I will. Actually, usually it's when I decide to re-wipe my machine. I want to get the latest Fedora or something, and I don't want to upgrade. I just want to go clean slate. That's when I declare tab bankruptcy. But unfortunately, now I can even sync tabs. So that's kind of gone away.
I have 268 tabs open right now.
Oh, man.
Welcome to the fold, Amalith.
Most of them are unloaded, so they're not taking up any resources, but still.
So back to Electron. From a developer point of view, there are some things about it that are quite difficult. So it has all these kind of upgrade mechanisms and things like that. And if you want to interface with the operating system keyring, there's all kinds of awkward stuff around that. Anything where you're interfacing with the operating system, the kind of stuff that you expect to be there in a web browser, location services and stuff like that, you can get it working, but it's just awkward and difficult. And in a browser, it just works. because the browser kind of is responsible for just making that stuff available to you. And in Electron, sometimes it's really difficult, and sometimes you have to like get an API key. Yeah, for the location services, you have to get an API key from Google before you can use it. And some of that stuff is surprisingly difficult. You would have thought it would just be like making a website, and then it's not, and things get nasty.
I think a key metric, though, is like if it is more bloated or for some metric worse, when there are also other opportunities or other possibilities, and they come with either no downsides or no more additional complexity. So what I mean by that is like if I wanted to get a cross-platform UI that was less bloated, I could write it all natively, and that's a lot more work or a lot more complexity. So we wouldn't say that like that's on equal footing. But I do think, like Amalith alluded to earlier, like there are other options that are Electron-like or esque. They get all the benefits of Electron, but without all the bloat. So in like those circumstances, I feel like that's why Electron is the like worst solution for me, because there are other options that for about the same amount of work, you get the same benefit.
And that are a bit nicer. For example, you mentioned Electron has issues integrating with the system keyring. I've been building an app in Wales which uses a Go backend with a web technology front end, and I just picked an off-the-shelf system keyring library, plugged it into the Go backend, and it worked just fine.
Yeah, I think one of the things about Electron is that it comes along with the whole Node stack, right? You're expected to write your entire application in Node, which means JavaScript, which is one of the worst languages, in my humble opinion, and also absolutely the worst ecosystem, right? Can anyone challenge me on that? So yeah, having to deal with that whole ecosystem, whereas some of the other options like Tauri allows you to write a lot of your logic in Rust, and you can use all of the cool stuff running native Rust. You're taking advantage of actually being a desktop app, but still making your front end or your UI in web technologies, which is one of the best technologies for doing that.
So what are some other reasons that these Electron alternatives are better then?
A big one is they do not come with the entire Blink rendering engine that is in Chrome. They use whatever web view your system already comes with. Most Linux systems have a web view. You might need to install one if you have a more minimal flavor. But Mac OS, Windows, Android, iOS, they all have some kind of web view baked in. So what Wales and Tauri do is they hook into the web view and cause it to render the front-end assets you've bundled with your application. And in the case of Wales, I don't know about Tauri because I haven't used it. In the case of Wales, it will also generate types and bindings in the front-end bundle. So from the front end, you can actually call Go functions in the back end. And that allows for some really nice encapsulation and ways of building your application. But you end up with a backend in Go or in Tauri in Rust, and your front end in whatever web tech you like, because you just need to make sure the web tech supports the web view you're targeting.
So you could just write it in HTML and CSS and JavaScript?
Yes, exactly. You could also use React or Svelte or whatever.
One of the million other frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
There's also frameworks out there that will do like a more WASM bundled effort. So like a WASM front end or WASM client. And that also has some other nice properties where you can do things like only re-rendering certain components when something about them changes, kind of like in a reactive nature. But it can be much more targeted because you're not going through this whole like virtual DOM that you would have to normally. So like there's all kinds of other benefits to other approaches outside of just Electron. I don't have any experience with Wales. It looks really interesting. I do have a little bit of experience with Tauri, and there's some of these other WASM-based ones like Dioxys or Leptos or U. I have a tiny bit of experience with those. In fact, I've only just started playing with them, but they also look equally promising.
One of the things that excites me about Tauri is that at least at one point they were talking to Servo people about Servo being one of the possible rendering engines. So rather than using your system web view, which you might not know exactly how it works, you could bundle Servo so you know how it works exactly because it's going to be the same on all platforms. And Servo can't render absolutely everything, but in an app like that, you can basically be flexible about how you make your UI to make sure it works in Servo, and then you can be sure it's going to work nicely.
You're specifically targeting Servo.
Exactly. So then you can have the certainty you want about it rendering exactly how you want, but it's going to be very light and stuff like that. So that seems really cool. But yeah, I think the thing that's different about these apps from Electron is that Electron is kind of like a virtual machine where your entire app just lives and runs inside the browser. Like, it's not strictly true, but that's kind of how it feels. Whereas these other things are really just using web technology to interface onto native code that's running on your machine. And that has pluses and minuses, right? It means that you can't just take a website and then it just turns into your app like you can with Electron. But on the other hand, it's like taking advantage of being a desktop app and being nicer in various ways.
From what I've heard with Towery, if your application is just a very basic progressive web app and there is no exactly platform backend, you can wrap it up in Towery and basically write zero Rust, which is really cool.
Yeah, you definitely can do that. Yeah, if it's just a pure front end thing, then yeah, it will just render that in a web view for you, and it's a nice wrapped up browser, really.
A place that I worked previously, we used Towery for something like that, where the whole front end was super nice, very, very pleasant to use, but it didn't use any Rust at all. It was only like as it got called into some of the different system interfaces that we had some Rust stuff running in the back end.
I'm fairly sure that's how I did the desktop app version of Boxstacker, my popular game. Not available from the Play Store anymore, but you can get it from its website.
Or F-Droid.
Yeah, it's on F-Droid still.
If you're going to bundle Servo, aren't you getting into the same problems as Electron?
I was thinking the same, but I assume, I have no idea whether this is the case, I assume Servo will be a little bit lighter and faster than Blink.
For now it will.
Yeah, right now it's small, but also in theory you could probably like only build the bits of Servo that you needed. That would be how I'd imagine it would work once Servo gets massive.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's just that Servo's cool, right? I don't care whether it's as big as Chrome. It's just not as bad, right?
Well, you keep saying Chrome, but it's not Chrome, is it? It's open source Chromium that we're talking about.
Yeah, I guess it's not even the whole of Chromium, right? It's Blink. Amal's been saying Blink, and I think you're probably right to say that.
Yeah, because you only need the rendering engine. You don't need the Chrome around it.
Yeah, but there's a lot. There's a lot of that.
Mm-hmm.
And when you bundle in half the JavaScript ecosystem, like your left pad and stuff, it gets big.
It's fine. Just pull the whole of NPM down. What could go wrong?
All the packages on there are legit.
Mm-hmm. It does very much suck that Firefox ripped out progressive web app support. I think Chromium and probably Chrome still have it. If Firefox did have it, then if you were visiting a progressive web app site, you could just hit install as app, and then you don't even need Towery, you don't need Whales, you don't need any of this native stuff. It's just the browser opening the app in a little cut down window.
Yes, so much. Why is this not the way all stuff works? I can't understand it. Why is it that I have an app to check for the train times that constantly has to refresh its website from the internet every time I open it? Why is it that my credit card app forgets my username and password every time, when if it was a website, my browser would remember the flipping username and password, but because it's a weird app that's actually just rendering the website from the internet, it's rubbish. Yes, why can't we have nice things?
Well, the worst thing is you open a native, in quotes, app and have to accept the cookie shit.
Yes.
And it's like, what? This is supposed to be a native app. You are quite clearly just wrapping your website in a native app. Just let me use the website.
But if you must wrap your website in a native app, please bundle the code of that website into the app so that I don't have to download it when I open the app.
But that would mean having to go through app stores and whatnot to update the code. Whereas if it's just a shell effectively pointing at your website, you can change the code whenever you want.
You know what is a really good shell pointing to a website? A web browser.
Nah.
There is an extension in the Firefox add-on store that re-adds progressive web app functionality to Firefox, but it requires installing some kind of desktop connector that I think creates desktop files for you to launch those progressive web apps. Because Firefox actually still has the capability to open and save progressive web apps. There's just no way to do that from the user side. You have to use some other extension or some other tool to make it do that.
But one of the problems with using websites versus native application installations is that they want to send you notifications, and people just instinctively click no whenever a website wants to send you notifications, because that system has been abused by so many companies and websites, people just say no to it. So how would you make them say yes to it?
Don't. If they don't want them, don't try to make them.
Yeah, I think they have to be valuable.
Right. If it's a chat app, they're going to want the notifications. They're not going to click no.
Yeah, or they're going to change their mind later, right? Like you have to somehow point out to them, you should go and change that if you click the wrong thing, right?
I suppose. But I said no to web.telegram.org and never regretted it because I don't want notifications.
Good. That is another advantage of web browsers. I'll tell you another advantage of stuff happening in web browsers. Some of these apps that I keep in my pinned tabs, I run them with like customizations where I've written JavaScript to make them not suck so much. And you can't do that with, it's much harder to do that with something like an Electron app.
I suppose. Say you had a YouTube Electron app, an official one from Google. Good luck blocking the ads in that. Yeah. Whereas in Firefox, you can just go to the YouTube website, use uBlock Origin, block all the ads. So
basically, Joe, you've brought up just another advantage of websites that actually makes things better for the user.
I have more reasons for more tabs.
Yay. You need an intervention, Kevin, by the sounds of things, man. If you were to make a native application and use a toolkit like GTK or Qt, how much harder is that than just wrapping it in something like Electron?
Well, first you have to be prepared for whichever framework you did not pick for them to get all kinds of pissy at you.
But I mean, let's be realistic. You don't care about the Linux users anyway, right? So you have to do it on Windows, you have to do it on Mac, you have to do it on Linux. You probably won't bother doing it on Linux. And really, you should probably do it in GTK and Qt just to avoid arguments. So even if it wasn't harder, you have to do it 3 times or however many times to support all those platforms. So that's the first point to make, right? It's just more work because you have to do it several times. And then it's hard to answer the question really objectively because I definitely do find it harder to write UIs in GTK than in the web. But I do have more experience with making web UIs than GTK. So probably someone who's really familiar with one of those technologies would be faster the other way around.
You said you got to build it 3 times. What if you do it in something like Flutter where it can just spit you out a binary for each platform? Or is that just massively oversimplifying things?
I think that's how Flutter works. It's just that Flutter is totally non-native, like way more non-native than a web UI. It's like a canvas that they just draw pixels on and then try and replicate the accessibility and everything else that the native platform has.
And most of the people want the native UI because it fits in with all of the rest of their system. The buttons look the same. Like all of it looks the same to include the framing. And yeah, Flutter just effectively can ignore that.
But you can accuse a web UI of being non-native as well, but I just think it's not as bad.
Well, so you're saying that even Electron is better than Flutter?
I mean, I've never used Flutter, and I don't think I've ever used a Flutter app, but yeah, absolutely.
A friend of mine was a core maintainer of a cross-platform GUI framework, I think similar to Flutter. And one of the things he and I had long conversations about, because I just found it so fascinating, was just the simplest text box. There are so many tiny ways of handling keystrokes in a text box that no one thinks about until they try to use them and realize, oh, this doesn't work. I have to go implement that. And then, oh, there's this other thing. And the list just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, and you can guarantee that you only use like 10% of what that box can do. You've never even heard of the other stuff. You're not going to implement it until someone logs a bug saying, hey, you've broken the way I do stuff.
But I do kind of return to this idea of you are a company like Slack. People are hassling you for a Linux version. You don't really have the resources to do it. So you just cobble together an Electron version and call it good.
Yeah, there's a reason why it's successful.
And surely it's better to have that than not have it. You can always use Slack in a browser if you want, or you can have a native app if you want.
Also, just like, even if I don't necessarily agree with this, like from a business perspective, going from a Slack Electron app to a native application is more of like a optimization. So it adds complexity. Sure, it makes it look nicer, maybe feels a little bit snappier, but ultimately, like, it's just an optimization. Like, you don't necessarily get any more feature or capability out of it. You might even like slow your development team down. So like for a business strictly that wants to support multiple platforms, like it's sometimes silly for them to even consider going to a native application. Like it's just not really worth the reward.
Yeah. I mean, if the question was, if you could have your way, would Electron not exist, my answer would definitely be no. I think it's a net good that people can throw these applications out there and they work on Linux. It's great.
But in a perfect world, you'd like them to make proper native versions.
Yeah, although like I say, I've given up now and I just think that web technologies are the best way to make UIs, so I would let them do that.
When I was deciding how to build the desktop app I'm working on, I was evaluating GTK versus Qt versus some other options, and I eventually picked web because I'm already familiar with it. It's very easy. I know the basics.
And it's really flexible. You can make it look how you want. Now, obviously, there are upsides and downsides to that. One of the advantages of using a framework like GTK or Qt or even some other platform's framework is that it actually constrains you to make something that looks like other apps, which is good for users often, but it doesn't make things look the way you want them to look.
And ultimately, a web browser these days is kind of an operating system.
Yep.
Certainly in terms of complexity. So maybe that's okay to just make everything on the web, or at least with web technologies.
It might also depend on like what you're trying to make. So for example, we've talked about the Z editor before, and they went their own route, tried to create like their own UI toolkit and like rendering engine, everything. And they did it purely for performance, because if you're editing code, potentially even like very large documents, you want the latency from when you hit a key to when it gets accepted and rendered on the screen to be like almost nothing. And to them, that was very important, and they couldn't get there any other way than by going off the beaten path and finding or building their own system entirely. And I would say like they've been successful in doing that, to the point where like even very large files, I've found that Zed has handled those better and still maintained those very low latencies than, like a terminal editor, like even just like straight up Vim. So it's impressive. If you want to go that extra mile, you can achieve some great things, but it is a ton of extra work.
Right, well, I think you've kind of answered my question, so thank you. And with that, we better get out of here. We'll be back in a couple of weeks, but until then, I've been Joe.
I've been Amalith.
I've been Kevin.
And I've been Andy.
See you later.